You are listening to Unseen Givens by Elton Thomas. Part 6, Chapters 21 through 24. Chapter 21, Growing Tensions. Part 1, The Legend of Ross Givens. The morning air in the office felt light and charged, as if there were an invisible current running through the space. Laura took a deep breath, standing at her desk as she organized her notes, and prepared for yet another day at Givens Corp. But unlike any other day, her patience felt stretched to its limit, tension simmering beneath the surface. She was trying to keep things in perspective, to see the humor in it all like her colleagues did. But after countless missed encounters with Ross Givens, the absurdity of it had begun to feel like a surreal test of her endurance. She sat down, her fingers tightening around her pen as she began to write a few reminders for herself on her notepad. Even something as routine as jotting down her tasks felt charged with irritation today, as if each small task were an affront to her sanity. Around her, colleagues bustled and chatted, seemingly oblivious to the barely restrained storm brewing within her. Adam, never one to miss an opportunity for a laugh, was already approaching her desk, a familiar grin plastered across his face. "Good morning, Laura. How's the Givens quest going?" His tone was light, teasing, and it was clear from the glint in his eyes that he was more than ready to stir up a little more of the ongoing joke. Laura looked up, narrowing her eyes. "If I hear one more word about the Givens curse, Adam, I'm going to start enforcing a strict no-joking policy at my desk." Adam held his hands up, laughing. "Hey, I'm just here to see how my favorite mystery chaser is doing. It's not every day we get to work alongside the star of Givens Corp's most epic tale. Everyone's talking about it, you know." "Don't remind me." Laura let out an exaggerated sigh, though she couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at her lips. Adam's infectious humor always managed to lighten her mood, even when she was on the verge of losing her patience. "Oh, come on, Laura," he continued, leaning against her desk. "You have to admit, it's a bit funny. You're practically famous around here." "Famous for what? Not being able to meet my boss?" She rolled her eyes, though there was a glint of amusement in her expression. "I've been here for months, Adam. Months. And I still haven't met the man who signed my hire letter." Adam nodded, chuckling. "Look on the bright side. By the time you do meet him, it'll be like you're finally meeting Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. People will gather around. There'll be applause. It'll be a historic moment." Laura snorted, shaking her head as she turned back to her notes. "I'm glad my professional career is providing so much entertainment for everyone." "Speaking of entertainment," Jared chimed in as he walked by, catching the last part of their conversation. He paused, raising an eyebrow as he glanced between Laura and Adam. "Did I hear something about another Ross sighting?" "Another non-sighting," Laura corrected, letting out a long sigh as she slumped back in her chair. "I swear, at this point, I'm going to start charging for tickets. Everyone else in this building seems to see him just fine. But me? I'm the chosen one, the one who gets to miss him every single time." Jared smirked, crossing his arms as he leaned against a nearby cubicle wall. "It's not personal, Laura. I think it's just fate. The office legend has taken on a life of its own, you know. People are actually placing bets on whether you'll ever get to meet him." Laura groaned, her face reddening slightly. "You're all enjoying this way too much. What's the bet now? Will he mysteriously vanish into thin air next time?" "No, but close," Jared replied, grinning. "There's a theory going around that he might be a hologram, just a virtual figure that the company projects into meetings to keep us all on our toes." Laura's laugh burst out before she could stop it, the absurdity of it all hitting her full force. "Oh, great. So now I'm working for a virtual CEO? What's next? A haunted office tour?" "Hey, that's not a bad idea," Jared said, winking. "We could do a whole tour, Unseen Givens and the Mysteries of Givens Corp." Adam leaned in, lowering his voice to a stage whisper. "I heard he's secretly working undercover as a coffee machine technician. Disguised himself just so he wouldn't have to face Laura Owens." Laura laughed, covering her face with her hands. "Please, spare me." But just then, Sharon walked by, overhearing the last part of the conversation. "Oh, are we talking about the Givens curse again? You should have seen Laura last time. It was almost sad, like watching someone try to catch a unicorn." Laura groaned, leaning back in her chair as she gazed up at the ceiling. I feel like a fool. Here I am, a professional analyst, someone hired to analyze complex projects, and I can't even locate my own boss. Sharon smirked, crossing her arms as she leaned against the edge of Laura's desk. Laura, at this rate, you're going to be on a first-name basis with everyone in this office except Ross Givens. Laura shot her a mock glare. Oh, trust me, Sharon, I know. I think even the janitorial staff has a closer relationship with him than I do. Adam, still grinning, gave her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Hey, look at it this way. You're basically an office celebrity, and celebrities have to deal with fans, right? Oh, wonderful, Laura said, rolling her eyes. That's exactly what I was hoping for when I took this job. But as her colleagues continued to joke, she felt her own tension slowly easing, the humor and camaraderie a balm for her frustration. They were all in on the joke now, a shared legend that had grown beyond just her and Ross Givens. It was a strange kind of solidarity, the laughter and teasing a reminder that, no matter how absurd her situation, she wasn't alone. Just then, Mindy appeared, a small, knowing smile on her face. Heard about the latest missed sighting, Laura? Another cyber attack, was it? Laura rolled her eyes, exasperated but smiling. You heard correctly, Mindy. Apparently the entire company's cybersecurity had to go into overdrive to ensure I didn't meet Ross. Mindy laughed, shaking her head. It's truly impressive, Laura. Most people just have the regular struggling to meet the boss problem. You, on the other hand, have turned it into an art form. Oh, don't encourage her, Adam said, feigning disapproval. She's going to start writing a memoir. My quest to meet the man they call Ross Givens. Laura shook her head, laughing despite herself. You know what? I might just do that, and I'll dedicate it to all of you, my loyal and relentless fan club. They all laughed, and Laura felt the lingering weight of her frustration lift a little, the shared humor and the good-natured teasing creating a warmth that filled the office. She had never expected to become part of an office legend, let alone one that revolved around her comically futile quest to meet the CEO. But somehow, amidst the jokes and camaraderie, it had become something she cherished, a shared story that connected her with her colleagues in ways she hadn't anticipated. All right, Laura said, holding up her hands in mock surrender. You all win. I'll embrace the Givens curse. But mark my words, I'm going to break it one day. Adam gave her a knowing grin, his eyes twinkling. We'll be here cheering you on, Laura, and when that day comes, we're going to throw you the biggest office party Givens Corp has ever seen. Laura smiled, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction in the absurdity of it all. Deal, she said, a newfound determination sparking within her. And when I finally meet him, you're all getting front row seats. With that, she turned back to her work, the warmth of her colleagues' laughter lingering in the air, a reminder that, no matter how frustrating her journey, she was never truly alone in it. Part 2. Hidden Shadows and Growing Distance. Laura's fingers tapped lightly against her keyboard, the familiar rhythm grounding her as she worked through a series of spreadsheets and client reports. Despite the laughter and banter from her colleagues, an air of subtle tension had started to settle over her daily routine. The frustrating saga of the Givens curse might have made her the office legend, but underneath it all, she could feel a quiet pressure building. The missed meetings, the endless preparations, the constant drive to make an impression on Ross Givens, it was all beginning to wear on her, though she did her best to keep it hidden. Across the office, Bradley Hendricks sat at his desk, his posture stiff, his expression tense. His gaze occasionally flickered toward Laura, lingering just a moment too long before he forced himself to look away. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a casual glance, just another manager checking in on his team. But Laura could feel a difference, an almost tangible distance that had begun to grow between them. Where once he had been open and even warm, there was now a guardedness to him, a reluctance that felt new and unsettling. At first, she'd brushed it off, chalking it up to the usual stress of the Printess project and the high-stakes partnerships Givens Corp had been negotiating. But as the days wore on, she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed distracted, even absent at times, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the office walls. Laura? Mr. Hendricks's voice cut through her thoughts, and she looked up, catching his eye. He had approached her desk with a stack of reports in hand, his face as composed as ever, though there was a subtle tension in his expression. He set the reports on her desk, glancing down at her with a tight smile. "Mr. Hendricks," she replied, giving him a polite nod. "Anything specific you need?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering down to the reports before he finally responded. "I wanted to go over these before the final submission. Let me know if you find any issues. We need this ready by the end of the week." Laura nodded, picking up the reports and flipping through the pages. She was used to his straightforwardness, his direct approach to work, but today there was something off, a heaviness in his voice that made her pause. "Of course," she said, meeting his gaze with a small smile. "I'll take care of it and let you know if there are any concerns." He gave her a quick nod, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Laura. I appreciate it." As he turned to leave, Laura noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way his shoulders seemed slightly hunched, as though he were carrying a weight he couldn't shake off. She watched him for a moment, her brow furrowing in concern. Something was clearly bothering him, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It wasn't like Mr. Hendricks to seem so distant, so withdrawn. "Everyone has bad days," she reminded herself, brushing off her unease. She had her own responsibilities, her own work to focus on. Whatever was bothering him, it was none of her business, and she certainly didn't have the time to dwell on it. But even as she returned to her work, a faint sense of worry lingered, a small voice at the back of her mind that wouldn't let her forget the look in his eyes, the tension in his posture. She pushed it aside, forcing herself to concentrate on the task at hand. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the day wore on, Mr. Hendricks found himself retreating more and more into his office, the familiar surroundings offering him a small measure of comfort amidst the turmoil that simmered within him. His hands clenched around the edge of his desk as he stared out the window, his gaze unfocused, his thoughts far from the bustling cityscape that stretched out before him. He'd always prided himself on his ability to keep his emotions in check, to remain calm and composed even in the face of adversity. But lately, it was as though a storm had been brewing within him, each passing day adding to the weight of the guilt he carried. Seeing Laura every day, working with her, watching her laugh and joke with her colleagues, seeing the determination in her eyes, was both a comfort and a curse. She was so full of life, so resilient, despite everything she had endured. But the knowledge of his own role in her tragedy, the memory of that day, lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of his failure. He had been there. He had seen the wreckage, had watched as the paramedics worked, as Laura's world crumbled around her, and he had done nothing to change it. The guilt gnawed at him, a bitter taste that he couldn't wash away, no matter how hard he tried. He pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to ease the ache that had settled there, a dull, persistent throb that refused to fade. His mind drifted back to the accident, to the sound of sirens, the smell of smoke, the sight of Laura holding onto her son's lifeless hand. Every day, he told himself it was for her sake that he kept quiet, that she didn't need to know, that the knowledge would only bring her more pain. But deep down, he knew that it was his own fear that held him back, the fear that she would look at him with anger, with hatred, if she ever learned the truth. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts, and he straightened, forcing himself to adopt a neutral expression. "Come in." Laura stepped inside, a polite smile on her face as she held up the stack of reports he had given her earlier. "I've gone through everything, Mr. Hendricks. Everything looks good, but I made a few notes on page 4 regarding the data. I thought it might be helpful." He nodded, taking the reports from her, his fingers brushing against hers briefly as he did. The contact, though fleeting, sent a surge of tension through him, and he quickly pulled his hand away, focusing on the papers in front of him. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Your attention to detail is appreciated." Laura tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curious expression. "Are you okay, Mr. Hendricks? You seem a bit off today." He froze, his heart pounding as he forced himself to meet her gaze. For a moment he considered telling her, considered opening up to her, letting her see the guilt, the remorse that had haunted him for so long. But the words caught in his throat, trapped by the fear that had kept him silent all these years. "I'm fine," he said finally, his voice steady but hollow. "Just a lot on my mind. The print test project, the deadlines. It's all just a bit overwhelming, I suppose." She gave him a sympathetic smile, her expression softening. "I understand. It's been a hectic few weeks for everyone. But if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the reports in his hands. "Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that." She hesitated, as though she wanted to say more, but after a moment, she simply nodded and turned to leave, closing the door quietly behind her. Once she was gone, Mr. Hendricks let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the reports. The guilt surged within him, stronger than ever, a relentless ache that gnawed at his heart. He had managed to keep his distance, to maintain the professional facade he had worked so hard to build. But every day it became harder, the weight of his secret pressing down on him, suffocating him. How long can I keep this up? He wondered, the thought filling him with dread. How long before she finds out? He knew that he couldn't keep hiding forever, that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. But the thought of facing her, of seeing the look of betrayal in her eyes, was almost more than he could bear. So, he stayed silent, retreating further into himself, his guilt a constant shadow that followed him wherever he went. And as he sat alone in his office, he felt the weight of his secret press down on him, a burden that he could never truly escape. Across the hall, Laura returned to her desk, her mind already shifting back to her tasks, the reports, the meetings, the endless stream of responsibilities that filled her days. She didn't have time to dwell on Mr. Hendricks's odd behavior, to wonder about the tension that lingered in his gaze. She had her own work to focus on, her own challenges to overcome. But even as she immersed herself in her tasks, a faint sense of unease lingered, a quiet whisper at the back of her mind, a feeling that something was off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And as the day wore on, the tension in the office grew, an invisible thread connecting them both, binding them in a web of secrets and silence that neither could escape. Chapter 22. Mindy's Support Grows. Part 1. Unexpected Allies. Laura sat at her desk, absorbed in a mountain of project files. The Printess acquisition was coming to a head, and her workload had grown exponentially in the past few days. Her desk was cluttered with notes, printouts, and highlighted documents. As much as she enjoyed the challenge, the strain was beginning to show. She let out a quiet sigh, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she focused on deciphering the latest set of financial reports. Across the room, Mindy lingered by the copier, watching Laura with an expression of quiet contemplation. Her gaze softened as she noticed the tired set of Laura's shoulders, the way her fingers massaged her temples whenever she thought no one was looking. Mindy felt a pang of sympathy, a feeling that had surprised her when it first surfaced. She remembered how hard she had fought for the position Laura now held, how she had initially viewed Laura as a rival, someone to undermine, if only out of professional pride. But somewhere along the way, her perception had shifted. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Laura's tenacity, her commitment, her unwavering focus, traits that had once made Mindy bristle, had slowly begun to earn her respect. And then there were the moments of vulnerability Mindy had glimpsed, moments that hinted at a deeper story, a quiet strength tempered by something painful, something personal. She didn't know what it was, but it had softened her toward Laura, shifting her from competitor to reluctant ally. Seeing Laura now, buried in her work and clearly struggling under the weight of it, Mindy felt an uncharacteristic urge to step in, to help. She straightened, smoothing her blouse and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she walked over to Laura's desk. Laura glanced up, surprised, her eyes widening slightly as she saw Mindy standing there. "Oh, Mindy. Hi." Mindy offered a small smile, her tone light but warm. "Hi, Laura. How's it going?" "Oh, Laura replied, gesturing to the mountain of paperwork with a tired smile. "Just trying to stay afloat. It's like every time I clear a pile, two more appear." Mindy chuckled, glancing at the disarray on Laura's desk. I know the feeling. Looks like the print test project has kept you pretty busy. You could say that, Laura replied, sighing. Between this and the other reports I need to finalize, I think I've reached peak caffeine levels. Mindy laughed, though her gaze remained thoughtful. Listen, if you need help, I'd be happy to take some of this off your plate. Laura's brows shot up and she blinked in surprise. Wait, really? I mean, I don't want to impose. Mindy shrugged, waving off her concern. It's no imposition. I'm between tasks at the moment, and I've got a bit of breathing room. Besides, we're all on the same team here, right? Laura's surprise lingered, mingling with a sense of gratitude that she couldn't quite hide. Thank you, Mindy. That's actually a huge relief. I don't know if I could have made it through all of this on my own. Mindy gave a small, understanding nod. It's no problem. Really. She leaned over, picking up a few of the more complex spreadsheets and scanning them with practiced ease. I'll tackle these first, if that's all right. I've got some experience with this kind of analysis from one of my previous projects. Laura smiled, nodding. That would be perfect. I really appreciate it. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, the quiet camaraderie between them a stark contrast to the wary distance that had once defined their interactions. Mindy worked efficiently, her focus sharp as she reviewed the spreadsheets, occasionally making notes in the margins. Laura watched her for a moment, struck by how different Mindy seemed, open, genuine, almost protective in a way Laura hadn't anticipated. A part of Laura remained puzzled by the shift, wondering what had prompted Mindy's change of heart. There was no explanation, no obvious reason for the sudden support, but Laura found herself grateful nonetheless. It was a strange feeling, this unexpected alliance, but it was also nice, reassuring even. In an office as intense and high stakes as Givens Corp, it was rare to find someone willing to lend a hand without expecting anything in return. So, Mindy said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence, how's the infamous Givens curse going? Any more near misses? Laura let out a low groan, covering her face with her hands. Don't even get me started. At this point, I feel like it's a cosmic joke. I don't know what I did to offend the universe, but apparently, it's determined to keep me from meeting Ross. Mindy chuckled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. You know, some people are saying it's become a rite of passage. Like, no one truly becomes a part of Givens Corp until they've witnessed the infamous Laura and Ross near-miss in action. Laura rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Great. So my legacy is going to be the Givens curse. I can't wait for that to show up in my annual review. Mindy laughed, her voice light and genuine, and Laura felt a warmth settle between them, a quiet understanding that went beyond the usual office banter. There was a softness to Mindy's gaze, a subtle warmth that hinted at something more, something unspoken. Hey, Mindy said, her tone softening. You've got a lot on your plate and you're handling it well. I know it's not easy, but you're doing a great job, Laura. Laura's heart warmed at the unexpected compliment, a flush of gratitude spreading through her. Thank you, Mindy. That means a lot, really. Mindy gave her a small smile, her eyes reflecting a depth of empathy that surprised Laura. It was as though she saw something in Laura, some shared understanding that went beyond words. Laura couldn't quite place it, but it was comforting, reassuring in a way that felt almost familiar. The afternoon wore on, and they continued working side by side, the once daunting stack of files gradually diminishing as they made their way through each report, each analysis. Laura found herself relaxing, the stress that had weighed on her earlier lifting as they worked together. She hadn't realized how much she needed the support, the presence of someone who understood the challenges, the expectations that came with working at Givens Corp. As the clock neared 5, Mindy leaned back, stretching her arms with a sigh of satisfaction. Well, I think we made a pretty good dent in that pile. Laura glanced at the neatly organized files on her desk, a feeling of accomplishment washing over her. We really did. I honestly don't know how I would have managed without your help. Mindy waved off the compliment, her expression softening. Don't mention it. It was actually kind of nice, working together. Makes the time go by faster. Laura smiled, nodding in agreement. Yeah, it does. We make a pretty good team, don't we? Mindy's smile was faint but genuine, her gaze warm as she looked at Laura. Yeah, we do. There was a moment of quiet between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. Laura felt a sense of gratitude she couldn't quite put into words, a warmth that lingered as Mindy gathered her things, preparing to leave for the day. As Mindy headed toward the door, she paused, glancing back at Laura. By the way, if you ever need help again, you know where to find me. Laura's smile widened, her heart full as she nodded. Thank you, Mindy. I really appreciate it. Mindy nodded, giving her a small, knowing smile before she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Laura with a feeling of warmth and reassurance she hadn't expected. It was a strange, unexpected gift, this newfound alliance, but it was one she found herself cherishing, a reminder that even in the most competitive of environments, there was room for kindness, for connection. And as she sat at her desk, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the office, she realized that she was no longer alone in her journey. Part 2. A Shift in Perception. The next morning, Laura arrived at the office, still buoyed by the unexpected support she'd received from Mindy the day before. The mountain of paperwork had been cut down to a manageable size, and she felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had been lifted. Mindy's assistance had come out of nowhere, but the change in their dynamic was undeniable. It felt strange to think of Mindy, once a rival, as an ally. Mindy, for her part, had noticed something intriguing in Laura, something that stirred both curiosity and a sense of recognition. There was a calm and precise manner in which Laura navigated her workspace, her fingers gliding across papers, her hands moving through piles and items on her desk with an ease that was almost uncanny. Laura's way of processing her environment had struck Mindy from the beginning, but now, watching more closely, she noticed subtle, almost imperceptible gestures, things that reminded her of her own brother, who was blind. Mindy entered the office with her usual brisk energy, greeting people with polite nods and brief smiles. She took her time walking past Laura's desk, making a show of flipping through her phone as she observed Laura in her peripheral vision. Laura was focused, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the low hum of office conversations, her fingers tapping a rhythmic beat on the desk. There was a meticulousness to Laura's movements, a heightened awareness of her surroundings that seemed to extend beyond mere observation. As Laura adjusted the angle of her chair, her hand brushed lightly over her notepad and laptop, checking the placement of each item without really looking at them. Mindy raised an eyebrow, intrigued. It was subtle, nothing anyone else might notice, but to her, it was a familiar motion, one she'd seen her brother perform countless times. "Morning, Laura," Mindy greeted her, her voice light, testing. She set her things down on the desk beside Laura, watching carefully. Laura looked up, offering her a warm smile. "Morning, Mindy. Thanks again for all your help yesterday. I feel like I can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel." "No problem," Mindy replied, keeping her tone casual as she leaned in, glancing at the files on Laura's desk. "Happy to help. Besides, it looks like you've got enough on your plate without having to wade through all of that alone." She watched as Laura organized the papers, her hands moving deftly through each stack, sorting, filing, double-checking every detail. There was a unique precision in the way Laura approached her work, a careful intentionality that fascinated Mindy. It was something she hadn't noticed before, at least not with this level of clarity. "So, how are you liking the project so far?" Mindy asked, making conversation as she observed Laura's movements out of the corner of her eye. Laura shrugged, her expression thoughtful as she ran her fingers along the edges of a file, her touch light but deliberate. "It's definitely challenging. The numbers are intense, and the timelines are, well, let's just say they're ambitious. But I like it. I like diving into something that requires so much attention to detail." Mindy nodded, keeping her tone casual, though her curiosity grew with every passing moment. "You seem to handle details better than anyone I know. It's impressive." Laura chuckled, a hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Well, I've had a lot of practice, I suppose. It's all about finding a rhythm, you know? Once you get that rhythm down, everything else just kind of falls into place." Mindy's eyes lingered on Laura for a moment, taking in her composed demeanor, the calm assurance in her movements. It was like watching someone who understood their environment on a deeper level, someone who wasn't just seeing, but feeling, sensing everything around them with an awareness that went beyond sight. Mindy's mind drifted back to her brother, to the countless times she had seen him navigate their home, the way he would run his fingers along the walls, the furniture, taking in each detail with a subtle grace that few people noticed. She had always admired that about him, the way he turned his so-called disability into a skill, a strength. And now, as she watched Laura, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a similarity there, something quietly familiar. Her thoughts were interrupted as Laura let out a soft sigh, closing one of the files and placing it neatly on the corner of her desk. She leaned back, rubbing her temples with a tired smile. "Long night?" Mindy asked, her tone softer now, genuinely curious. Laura nodded, her eyes reflecting a hint of weariness. "Yeah, you could say that. I was up late going over these reports. It's one of those projects where you feel like every detail matters, you know? Like if you miss one thing, it could throw everything off balance." Mindy nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of empathy. "I get it. That kind of attention to detail takes a lot out of you." Laura glanced over, her expression softening as she met Mindy's gaze. "It does, but I suppose it's just part of the job." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the office surrounding them. Mindy found herself studying Laura's face, noting the quiet determination in her eyes, the strength that seemed to radiate from her even in moments of exhaustion. It was a strength Mindy respected, one that she found herself drawn to, despite her initial reluctance. As the day wore on, Mindy continued to offer her support, stepping in whenever she noticed Laura falter or struggle with the workload. She would bring over files, make small suggestions, offer to take on tasks that seemed especially tedious. To anyone else, it might have seemed like simple teamwork, but for Mindy, it was something more, an unspoken recognition, a quiet act of solidarity. In the afternoon, as Laura focused intently on a spreadsheet, Mindy approached her desk with a cup of coffee, setting it down gently beside her. "Here," Mindy said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I thought you could use a pick-me-up." Laura looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as she took the cup. "Oh, wow. Thank you, Mindy. That's really thoughtful." Mindy shrugged, playing it off with a casual smile. "It's no big deal. Besides, we're a team, right?" Laura smiled, her gratitude evident in her expression. "Right. Still, thank you. I really appreciate it." Mindy watched as Laura took a sip, her movements careful, her hands steady. It was such a small thing, but it filled Mindy with a strange sense of satisfaction, a feeling that she was doing something good, something right. She didn't fully understand it, but she knew that helping Laura felt meaningful in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the day drew to a close, Laura began packing up her things, carefully placing each item in her bag. Mindy watched from her desk, a sense of quiet admiration settling over her. She couldn't deny that Laura's resilience, her strength, her unique way of navigating the world had left an impression on her. There was something about Laura that resonated with her, a sense of familiarity that went beyond mere friendship. And though she didn't fully understand it, Mindy knew that she wanted to support Laura, to stand by her in whatever small ways she could. It was a subtle shift, a quiet kindness that required no explanation, no words. It was simply a shared understanding, a silent bond that connected them in ways neither of them could put into words. And as they both prepared to leave, Mindy felt a sense of peace, a feeling that, perhaps, this was the beginning of something new. A partnership, a friendship, and maybe even a path toward healing, for both of them. Chapter 23. Vivid Flashbacks. Part 1. Shadows of the Past. That night, Laura's sleep was restless. She turned and twisted beneath the blankets, caught in a realm where dreams and memories collided, a haunting landscape shaped by fragments of the past she could never fully escape. Her mind drifted, heavy and clouded, as she sank deeper into the dream, her consciousness folding into shadows that blurred and twisted around her. She was back in the car. She could feel the hum of the engine beneath her, the slight vibrations reverberating up through the seat and into her bones. Sunlight filtered through the windshield, casting soft golden hues that illuminated the interior. Next to her, Sam's voice echoed warmly, the faint lilt in his tone full of love and affection as he talked about their plans, their dreams, the life they were building together. And in the back seat, Hank's laughter filled the small space, bright and unbridled, his joy a constant, steady beat that filled her with warmth. "Hank, did you know that the T-Rex was the king of dinosaurs?" Laura asked, glancing in the rearview mirror to catch her son's reaction. "Of course, Mom. Everyone knows that." Hank's voice was proud, a little defiant, his small face scrunched in concentration as he recounted his dinosaur facts. "And did you know T-Rexes could bite with 12,000 pounds of force?" She laughed, the sound light and free. "Well, I hope I don't have to worry about any T-Rexes around here." "Don't worry, Mom. I'd protect you." Hank's words were confident, and Sam chuckled beside her, reaching over to squeeze her hand. It was one of those small, perfect moments, the kind that felt infinite, eternal, like time itself had paused to capture that sliver of happiness. But then, as suddenly as the joy had blossomed, the scene shifted, darkening around the edges. Her heart started to pound, her chest tightening as a sense of dread seeped in. She felt herself tense, her grip on the steering wheel tightening, her gaze snapping forward to the road that stretched ahead. The world around her began to blur, the colors fading, the sounds dulling, until all that remained was the road, winding and silent, an endless stretch that seemed to pull her forward. The headlights of the oncoming car appeared out of nowhere, a blinding flash of white that swallowed everything in its path. She felt the jolt, the impact, the world shattering around her in a cacophony of sound and motion. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of safety. Everything was ripped away, leaving only the brutal, unyielding chaos of the accident. In the dream, the memory unfolded in fragments, disjointed flashes that filled her with a sense of helplessness. She could hear the grinding of metal, the sharp, piercing shatter of glass as it splintered and scattered across her skin. The weight of the airbag pressed against her, rough and unyielding, and she struggled to move, her body heavy and unresponsive. "Hank." The name slipped from her lips, a desperate whisper that carried all her fear, her love, her need to know he was safe. She tried to turn, to look back at him, but her vision blurred, her head throbbing with a sharp, relentless ache that left her disoriented, lost in a fog of pain and confusion. In the haze, she could feel a presence beside her, a figure moving closer, a hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. The touch was gentle, grounding, a lifeline amidst the chaos. She couldn't see the person's face, couldn't make out their features, but she felt their presence, a steady, reassuring force that anchored her in the midst of the turmoil. "Hold on," the voice said, calm and steady. It was a voice filled with kindness, a warmth that cut through the pain, soothing her, urging her to stay present, to hold on just a little longer. She tried to focus, to hold on to the sound of that voice, but the edges of her vision darkened, the world slipping away, receding into shadows as the pain surged, overwhelming her senses. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow and ragged as she fought to stay conscious, to keep herself anchored in the present. But the darkness was relentless, pulling her deeper, drowning out the light, the warmth, the safety. "Hank. Sam." She tried to call their names, her voice weak, barely a whisper, but it felt like shouting into a void, a vast emptiness that swallowed her words, leaving her alone, adrift in a sea of shadows. The figure beside her shifted, their grip on her shoulder tightening, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone, that they were there, holding her, anchoring her in the darkness. She wanted to see their face, to know who they were, but her vision was blurred, the details obscured, as if some invisible barrier kept her from fully seeing, fully knowing. The dream shifted again, and she was outside the car now, lying on the cold, hard ground, the distant wail of sirens filling the air. She could feel the rough texture of the asphalt beneath her, the sting of gravel digging into her skin. Her body felt heavy, leaden, as if every movement required an impossible effort. She tried to open her eyes, to make sense of her surroundings, but her vision was clouded, a fog of pain and exhaustion obscuring everything. The figure was still there, kneeling beside her, their hand warm against her skin, a steadying presence amidst the chaos. She could hear their voice, calm and reassuring, though the words were muffled, indistinct, lost in the roar of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Just hold on. Help is on the way." The words echoed, a faint lifeline that tethered her to the present, to the thin thread of consciousness that she clung to with every ounce of strength she had left. She could feel the weight of her grief, her love, her desperation pressing down on her, filling her with a raw, unrelenting ache that left her breathless. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, the scene blurred, shifting again, until she was back in the car, trapped in the suffocating silence that followed the impact. She could feel the cold metal pressing against her skin, the sting of blood on her lips, the sharp metallic scent filling the air. "Hank!" She tried to call out, her voice barely a whisper, but there was no response, only the deafening silence that filled the void, a silence that weighed on her like a shroud. In the dream, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the empty space beside her, a desperate gesture that held all her love, her fear, her need to know that her son was safe. But there was nothing, only the cold, unyielding darkness that surrounded her, pressing down on her, suffocating her. The figure reappeared, their presence a faint glow in the darkness, a quiet strength that soothed the raw edges of her pain. They knelt beside her, their hand resting on her shoulder, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone, that someone was there, holding her, anchoring her amidst the chaos. She wanted to ask them who they were, to see their face, to know the identity of this stranger who had been there in her darkest moment. But the dream remained stubbornly vague, the details blurred, the face hidden, as if some invisible force kept her from fully seeing, fully knowing. The dream began to fade, the edges softening, the shadows receding, leaving only the faint memory of that touch, that voice, that presence. She felt herself drifting, her consciousness slipping away, returning to the quiet stillness of sleep, a sense of peace settling over her as the last remnants of the memory faded into darkness. When she finally woke, her heart was racing, her body drenched in sweat, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to shake off the remnants of the dream. She sat up, pressing her hands to her temples as she tried to steady her racing thoughts, to piece together the fragments of the memory that had resurfaced, vivid and haunting. It was the same dream, the same memory, yet each time it returned, it grew sharper, clearer, as if the details were slowly coming into focus, revealing glimpses of a truth that had long been hidden. She could still feel the weight of that hand on her shoulder, the warmth of that presence beside her, the faint echo of a voice that had soothed her in the darkness. But who had been there? Who had knelt beside her in the wreckage, offering comfort, holding her steady in the midst of the chaos? She closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she tried to remember, to grasp at the fading fragments of the dream, the faint impressions that lingered on the edge of her consciousness. But the details eluded her, slipping through her fingers like sand, leaving only the shadow of a memory, a lingering sense of familiarity that she couldn't quite place. The memory felt close, achingly close, as though the truth were just beyond her reach, hidden beneath layers of time and grief. She felt a sense of urgency, a need to know, to remember, to piece together the fragments that had haunted her for so long. But for now, all she could do was wait, to let the memories come in their own time, to trust that one day, the full picture would reveal itself. And until then, she would hold on to that fleeting sense of comfort, that quiet reassurance that, in her darkest moment, she hadn't been alone. Part 2. The Weight of Silence. The early morning sunlight filtered into Mr. Hendricks's office, casting long golden beams across his polished desk and the neatly stacked papers that sat untouched beside him. Outside his window, the city bustled to life, a steady hum of traffic and voices drifting up from the street below. But inside his office, the silence was thick, a quiet tension that seemed to press down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He sat in his chair, his hands clasped together as he stared down at the floor, his mind distant. It had become a routine now, this silent vigil, This habit of watching Laura, studying her without truly engaging, observing her movements as though he were searching for something, some sign that she was all right, that she had moved on. But recently, he had noticed a change in her. It was subtle, nothing anyone else might see, but to him, it was unmistakable. There were moments when her gaze would grow distant, when her fingers would still on the keyboard, her expression softening as though she were lost in thought, drawn back into memories she couldn't quite place. He could see it in the way she would pause, her brow furrowing, her eyes clouded with something he recognized all too well. She was remembering. The thought filled him with a cold dread, a sense of inevitability that made his stomach twist. He had known, deep down, that this day would come, that there would come a time when the memories she had buried would resurface, clawing their way back into her consciousness. And now, as he watched her, he felt the weight of his guilt grow, a heavy, suffocating presence that wrapped around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. Across the office, he could see her sitting at her desk, her gaze distant as she stared out the window, her expression unreadable. She was still, her hands resting on the edge of her desk, her posture tense as though she were bracing herself against an unseen force. He knew that look, knew it because he had worn it himself, had felt that same sense of helplessness, that same haunted expression that spoke of memories too painful to bear. For a brief moment, he considered going to her, crossing the room to offer some small comfort, some reassurance that she wasn't alone. But the thought of revealing the truth, of laying bare the weight of his own guilt, held him back. He couldn't do it. Not now. Not when the memories were still raw, still jagged edges that threatened to cut them both if he dared to expose them. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her as he tried to steady his breathing, to quell the rising tide of regret that threatened to overwhelm him. It had been years since the accident, years since he had knelt beside her on that cold, unforgiving pavement, his hand resting on her shoulder as he tried to offer what little comfort he could. But the memory was as vivid as ever, etched into his mind like a scar, a constant reminder of his failure, his inability to save the ones she had loved. Every day he told himself that he had done the right thing, that keeping the truth from her was an act of kindness, a way of sparing her the pain of knowing. But in moments like these, when he saw the shadows in her eyes, the quiet grief that lingered beneath her calm exterior, he couldn't help but wonder if he was only protecting himself, shielding himself from the weight of her anger, her grief, her betrayal. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts, and he straightened, quickly adopting a neutral expression as he called out, "Come in." The door opened and Laura stepped inside, her expression composed, though he could see the faint traces of exhaustion in her eyes, the lingering shadows that told him she hadn't slept well. She offered him a polite smile, her gaze steady as she approached his desk. "Good morning, Mr. Hendricks," she said, her tone professional, though there was a softness to her voice, a quiet vulnerability that made his chest tighten. "Good morning, Laura," he replied, his voice steady as he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before she looked back up, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, of course. I wanted to go over a few details for the print test project, if you have a moment." "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Please, take a seat." She nodded, settling into the chair across from him as she pulled out a stack of papers, her hands steady though he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she arranged them on his desk. He waited, his gaze fixed on her as she gathered her thoughts, her focus intense as she reviewed the documents. But as she spoke, outlining the project details, he could see the faint flicker of distraction in her eyes, the way her gaze would drift, her words faltering for a brief moment before she caught herself, her professionalism never truly slipping, but revealing just enough for him to see the truth. "Laura," he said quietly, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Are you sure everything's all right?" She looked up, her expression shifting as she met his gaze, a faint vulnerability flickering in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Yes, Mr. Hendricks. I haven't been sleeping well, that's all." He nodded, his gaze steady as he studied her, taking in the subtle lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the tension in her posture. He wanted to reach out, to offer some small reassurance, but the words caught in his throat, trapped by the weight of his own guilt. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked finally, his voice softer, almost hesitant. She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the papers in front of her. "No, thank you. I think it's just a matter of time." He felt a pang of guilt, his chest tightening as he watched her, the weight of his silence pressing down on him like a physical force. He wanted to tell her, to unburden himself of the secret he had carried for so long, but the thought of her reaction, the pain it would bring, held him back. She deserves to know, he thought, the words echoing in his mind, a quiet but persistent voice that had haunted him for years. She deserves the truth. But as he looked at her, saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the faint vulnerability that she tried so hard to hide, he knew he couldn't do it. Not now. Not when she was already carrying so much. He took a slow, steady breath, forcing himself to push the guilt aside, to focus on the task at hand. She was here for a reason, here to discuss the project, and he owed it to her to keep things professional, to maintain the distance that had always existed between them. "All right," he said finally, his tone steady, though there was a hint of regret in his voice. "Let's go over the details. I want to make sure we're on the same page before we move forward." She nodded, her gaze focused, though he could see the faint traces of distraction in her eyes, the quiet sadness that lingered just beneath the surface. She went through the project updates, her voice steady and composed, but he could feel the weight of her grief, a silent presence that filled the room, wrapping around them both in a quiet, unspoken bond. As she finished, she looked up, offering him a polite smile, though there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze, a quiet vulnerability that made his chest tighten. "Thank you, Mr. Hendricks," she said, her voice soft. "I appreciate your support." He nodded, his gaze steady as he met her eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, a constant, unyielding presence that he could never truly escape. "Of course, Laura," he replied, his tone gentle. "If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." She nodded, her smile faint but genuine as she gathered her papers, standing to leave. He watched her go, his heart heavy, his mind filled with the words he could never bring himself to say. As the door closed behind her, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he stared out the window, the weight of his guilt settling over him like a shroud. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever, knew that one day the truth would come to light, that she would learn the full extent of his involvement in her tragedy. But for now, he would remain silent, would carry the weight of his guilt alone, a silent guardian of a secret that had haunted him for years. And as he sat there, alone in the quiet of his office, he felt the weight of his silence grow heavier, a burden he could never truly escape, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. Chapter 24. Closer Than Ever. Part 1. The Suit and the Givens Curse. The hall was filled with a gentle hum, a blend of voices and laughter echoing against the high ceilings and giving the spacious room a warmth that extended beyond the friendly, bustling atmosphere. Long tables had been set up with white tablecloths and trays of food prepared for distribution, each decorated with small arrangements of flowers and candles that cast a soft glow. Volunteers moved between tables, greeting each guest with a smile and a kind word, creating a sense of unity and shared purpose that was both comforting and exhilarating. Laura took a deep breath, savoring the warmth of the room, the joy of the gathering. It was the annual Givens Corp charity event, a night where the company's employees and management came together to serve dinner to those in need. The energy was uplifting, a break from the usual corporate structure, and Laura felt a sense of pride as she looked around at her co-workers, each one fully immersed in the spirit of giving. Tonight, however, held a promise beyond the charity event, a hope that had Laura's heart pounding in anticipation. Ross Givens was scheduled to attend. She'd heard whispers that he always made a point to show up for the charity events, and her excitement was almost palpable. For the first time in what felt like ages, she was finally going to meet the elusive man himself, ending what her colleagues had come to call the Givens curse. Laura had dressed with care, choosing a simple but elegant dress and pulling her hair back into a neat ponytail. She wanted to look professional but approachable, to make a good impression when the time finally came to meet Ross. After months of close calls and missed encounters, she was determined to be memorable, to finally make her presence known. She moved through the hall with a tray of bread rolls, weaving between tables as she greeted guests, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Ross. Her heart raced each time she caught a glimpse of a tailored suit, her mind already picturing the moment when she would finally shake his hand, introduce herself, and break the strange spell that had kept them apart for so long. And then, there he was. Near the center of the hall, standing beside a table where a family was gathered, was a tall man in a dark, finely tailored suit. The exact suit she'd seen a glimpse of during a couple of near misses. It was unmistakable, a distinctive cut and color that fit him like a glove. Laura's breath caught, her pulse quickening as she recognized him. "This is it," she whispered to herself, her lips curving into a small smile. "The curse is finally over." She started forward, her steps measured and steady as she made her way across the room, her gaze fixed on Ross. It was almost surreal, the culmination of months of near misses and frustrating encounters that had built into this moment, this chance to finally put a face to the name that had loomed over her career at Givenscorp. But as she crossed the hall, a hand touched her arm, and she turned to find Sharon smiling at her, a friendly glint in her eyes. "Laura, I didn't know you'd be here," Sharon said, her voice warm as she pulled Laura into a quick hug. "It's wonderful to see you. Isn't this event incredible?" Laura smiled, nodding as she returned the hug. "It really is, Sharon. It's such a beautiful gathering. I was just on my way to—" She glanced over Sharon's shoulder, her gaze drifting back to Ross, who was now engaged in conversation with another volunteer. The distance between them seemed to stretch, and Laura's heart beat faster, a quiet urgency rising in her. "Anyway, I won't keep you," Sharon said, releasing her with a warm smile. "It's just so good to see you here. Enjoy the evening, Laura." "Thank you, Sharon. You too." Laura's voice was warm, though her mind was already refocused on her mission. With a quick nod, she started forward again, her eyes fixed on Ross's suit as she made her way through the crowd. She was so close now, only a few steps away, and her excitement grew, a palpable energy that made her movements feel lighter, almost buoyant. But then she heard Adam's voice behind her, his familiar laughter ringing out as he called her name. "Laura, hey, Laura!" She turned, her patience strained but her smile polite as she greeted him. Adam was dressed casually, his usual light-hearted demeanor a welcome presence, though tonight it felt like one more obstacle between her and Ross. "Adam?" She greeted him, forcing herself to smile as he approached. "I'm glad you could make it." He grinned, his eyes alight with the familiar teasing glint she had come to know. "Oh, you know me. I wouldn't miss a chance to witness history. I heard you might finally meet Ross tonight." Laura laughed, shaking her head as she waved him off. "Very funny, Adam. But yes, actually, I think tonight might be the night." "Don't let me hold you up," he said, his grin widening. "Go make history, Laura." She nodded, giving him a grateful smile as she turned back to the hall, her gaze scanning the crowd until she spotted the suit again. Her heart raced as she made her way toward him, her steps quickening with each moment, her excitement building to a crescendo as she approached. Finally, she was only a few feet away, close enough to see the details of the suit, the familiar cut and color that had become synonymous with Ross Givens in her mind. She took a steadying breath, a smile spreading across her face as she stepped up beside him, her voice filled with quiet triumph as she spoke. "The curse is finally over," she said, her tone warm and confident as she reached out a hand, ready to introduce herself at last. The man turned, his expression one of polite confusion as he looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The words hit her like a bucket of cold water, her smile faltering as she stared at him, a wave of disbelief washing over her. She took a step back, her gaze shifting from his face to the suit, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach as she realized her mistake. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I thought you were someone else." The man chuckled, his expression warm and understanding as he shrugged. No worries. I get that a lot, actually. Must be the suit. Laura forced a smile, nodding politely as she backed away, her mind racing, trying to process the situation. She had been so sure, so certain that this was finally the moment. But now, standing alone in the middle of the crowded hall, she felt a wave of frustration, a quiet anger bubbling beneath the surface as the realization set in. Ross wasn't here. She took a deep breath, her gaze scanning the hall once more as she tried to regain her composure. She spotted Sharon near the entrance, talking to Jared, and decided to join them, her mind still reeling as she approached. "Sharon, Jared," she greeted them, her tone polite, though there was a hint of exasperation in her voice. "You wouldn't happen to know where Ross is, would you?" Sharon exchanged a quick glance with Jared, her expression sympathetic as she turned back to Laura. "Oh, didn't you hear? He had to cancel last minute. His family came into town unexpectedly, and he decided to spend the evening with them instead." Laura's heart sank, the disappointment crashing over her in a wave as she nodded, forcing a smile. "I see. Well, that makes sense, I suppose." She could feel the laughter and light-hearted banter of her colleagues around her, a stark contrast to the frustration simmering within her. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke, a never-ending game that kept her just out of reach, forever chasing a goal that remained elusive. She let out a quiet sigh, forcing herself to smile as she thanked Sharon and Jared, turning away as she made her way toward the back of the hall. The evening was nearly over, and she suddenly felt drained, the excitement that had filled her earlier now replaced by a heavy, lingering disappointment. As she walked through the crowd, her gaze drifting over the faces around her, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever meet Ross, if she would ever break the strange, infuriating Givens curse that seemed to define her time at the company. But even as the frustration lingered, a small part of her couldn't help but laugh, a quiet, rueful chuckle that rose up despite the disappointment. After all, it was absurd, this endless game of near misses and mistaken identities. And maybe, just maybe, the universe was testing her, teaching her patience, resilience, a quiet strength that she hadn't known she possessed. She took a deep breath, lifting her head as she walked toward the exit, her steps steady, her gaze forward. Tonight hadn't gone as planned, but she wouldn't let that stop her. There would be other chances, other opportunities, and she would keep moving forward, keep reaching, keep striving, until one day she would finally break the curse. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, the laughter and warmth of the hall fading behind her, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her, a quiet determination that filled her with strength. The curse wasn't over, not yet, but one day she knew it would be. Part 2. The Running Joke of Givens Corp. Laura returned to the office the following morning, her mind still replaying the events of the charity event. The memory of that man, dressed in Ross Givens's familiar suit and standing there with such an oblivious, puzzled expression, was almost too much to bear. She could barely contain her frustration, her exasperation, and yet, buried beneath it all, was a growing sense of humor about the absurdity of her ongoing Givens curse. As she walked toward her desk, she noticed her teammates casting glances in her direction, grinning as if they had already heard about her latest close encounter. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Of course, the story had already made its way around the office. Givens Corp was practically a small city in itself, yet when it came to the escapades of the girl who could never meet her boss, news seemed to travel faster than any email could. Just as she reached her desk, she heard a familiar voice call out from across the office. "Laura, heard you finally got to meet the one and only Ross Givens last night." She turned to see Adam leaning against a cubicle wall, arms crossed, his grin as wide as it was mischievous. Next to him stood Sharon, her eyes gleaming with amusement, and a few other team members who had stopped to listen in, all wearing expressions that ranged from sympathy to outright amusement. Laura let out a long sigh, a rueful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Oh, you heard about that, did you?" Adam raised an eyebrow, chuckling as he crossed his arms. "Heard about it? It's practically office lore by now. You, standing there, ready to shake hands with what you thought was Ross Givens, declaring, 'The curse is finally over,' only to realize it was some guy wearing his old suit." Laura rolled her eyes, though she couldn't quite hide her own smile. "I swear, the universe is laughing at me." "It probably is," Sharon replied with a sympathetic nod, though her lips twitched with amusement. "But you have to admit, Laura, the timing is almost too perfect. It's like something out of a sitcom." "That would make me the bumbling protagonist, I suppose," Laura replied, feigning exasperation as she dropped her bag onto her desk and pulled out her chair. "Bumbling? No way," Adam said, grinning. "More like determined. You've put in more effort trying to meet the CEO than the rest of us put into a whole week's work." She laughed, shaking her head as she sat down. "Well, at least I'm known for something around here." "Oh, come on, Laura," Adam replied, his grin widening. "You're known for a lot of things, but let's be real, the Givens curse is legendary." Laura groaned, leaning back in her chair as she crossed her arms, though she couldn't quite suppress her smile. "You're all terrible, you know that?" "Terrible? We're just here to witness greatness," Sharon said, pulling up a chair beside Laura's desk as she gave her a playful nudge. "Do you know how many people in this company have had a one-on-one with Ross? And here you are, practically his shadow, yet you've never even seen the man's face." "It's true," Adam chimed in. "You've managed to miss him every time, and I mean every time. It's like some kind of magic trick." "Oh, don't remind me," Laura replied, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Do you know how many times I've had this moment where I'm finally about to meet him, only for something to go horribly wrong?" "Oh, we know," Jared said, walking over with a grin as he crossed his arms. "I think half the office could recite your Givens near misses from memory." The group laughed, and Laura joined in, shaking her head as she leaned back in her chair. It was ridiculous, this ongoing saga, but she couldn't deny that it had become a part of her story at Givens Corp, an office legend that had drawn her colleagues together, uniting them in a shared humor that lightened the weight of daily tasks. "And let's not forget," Sharon added, her eyes twinkling, "the incident with the fire alarm, the time he got stuck in traffic, the cyber attack, every obstacle in the book." Laura held up her hands, a laugh escaping her. Okay, I get it. The universe is conspiring against me. I'll just have to make peace with the fact that I might never actually meet the man." "Oh no, Laura, don't give up," Adam said, leaning in with a grin. "You know what they say, persistence pays off." "Or at least gives us a good laugh," Jared added, chuckling. "Seriously though, at this rate we might need to start a pool on when you'll finally meet him." "Or if I'll ever meet him," Laura replied, her tone mock-dramatic as she placed a hand over her heart. The group laughed again, the camaraderie easing the sting of her latest failure. It was absurd, this strange curse that seemed to follow her, but in moments like these, she couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the laughter, for the light-hearted banter that turned her frustration into something she could laugh about. Then, across the room, a familiar face appeared, the random employee that Mr. Hendricks had repeatedly mistaken for someone else. He had become a part of their team's joke circuit, an unassuming character who somehow managed to fly under Mr. Hendricks's radar, always receiving the same task or direction as if he were a new hire every time. Laura smirked as she saw him approach, her amusement growing. "Oh, here he comes, the only one who might be cursed as much as I am." The employee grinned, shaking his head as he reached them, his voice filled with exasperated humor. "Don't even get me started. Mr. Hendricks just assigned me another report. I swear, I've done the same report for him 3 times and he still doesn't remember my name." "See, Laura," Adam said, nudging her with a grin. "You're not the only one dealing with strange luck." "Oh, believe me, I'm aware," Laura replied, grinning. "It's like we're trapped in some kind of cosmic comedy." The employee laughed, shaking his head. "Well, at least you have an office legend. I'm just the guy who keeps getting handed the same assignments." "But hey, think about it," Jared said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "You two are practically the mascots of Givens Corp at this point. People know your stories by heart." Laura groaned, though she couldn't help but laugh. "Great. That's exactly what I wanted for my career." "Hey, don't knock it," Sharon said, winking. "Every company needs a few good legends, and thanks to you, we have one of the best." They all laughed, the sound filling the office with warmth and camaraderie. Laura glanced around, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude for her team, for the way they had embraced her curse and turned it into something to be shared, something to laugh about. As the laughter faded, Sharon leaned over, her expression softening as she placed a comforting hand on Laura's shoulder. "But seriously, Laura, you know we're all rooting for you. One of these days, you're going to meet Ross, and it's going to be epic. It'll be worth the wait." Laura smiled, the warmth in her chest growing. "Thanks, Sharon. That means a lot." "And when it happens," Adam added, grinning, "we're throwing you the biggest party this office has ever seen." The group cheered, their voices echoing in the bustling office as they made their way back to their desks, their laughter and support lingering in the air like a warm embrace. Laura returned to her seat, her heart lighter, the frustration of the night before softened by the shared humor, the camaraderie that had become a part of her daily life at Givens Corp. Sitting down, she took a deep breath, letting the moment settle over her. Yes, the Givens curse was still alive and well, but today, it didn't feel like a burden. Today, it felt like a story that connected her with her teammates, that brought laughter and lightness to an otherwise ordinary day. And as she turned on her computer, ready to dive back into the day's tasks, she felt a quiet determination settle within her, a resolve to keep pushing forward, to keep reaching for that moment when the curse would finally be broken. One day, she knew, she would meet Ross Givens. And until then, she would embrace the legend, the laughter, the unexpected journey that had become her story at Givens Corp.